During World War II, there were lots of heavy tanks going around. The USSR used them to break through German defenses. The British designed them to support infantrymen in an attack. But some major powers, including the US, didn't have heavy tanks at their disposal. The World War I era Liberty tank was a thing of the past, and for quite a while there was no contender for the title at all. It made perfect sense. There were no major land battles for the country to fight, and on the global stage, there was heavy emphasis on the Air Force and the Navy anyway. The US started to work on their own new heavy tank only in the late 1930s, with legendary Gladian M. Barnes, who was involved in the development of the M4 Sherman, and he was in charge of the project. Initially, a multi-turreted design was considered, but later the decision was made to switch to a single turret design with a 76mm cannon. In 1942, one of the prototypes was accepted into service as the M6. It was a decent vehicle with competitive characteristics. It was powerful and pretty mobile thanks to its General Electric electrical transmission. But by 1943, it was already obsolete. Then there was the T-14, a joint project between the United States and the United Kingdom that aimed to produce a universal infantry tank. The vehicle shared many parts with the M4 Sherman, including the layout and the gun. Even though the British were aching for a new heavy tank, the T-14 project never came to fruition, as even the pilot model only made it to the UK in 1944. It's not to say that no designs actually made it to the war. For example, there was the case of the Sherman Jumbo, coming in strong with its excellent armor. Initially, American engineers weren't very optimistic about the prospects of a medium tank with heavy armor, because all that additional weight would be seriously taxing the suspension. But the Jumbo turned out to be a pretty reliable vehicle. More importantly, its frontal armor was thick enough to protect the crew from a hit with an 88mm Flak 36 gun, a feat that made the tank very popular with American tankers. Apart from the modified Sherman, American crews also had a chance to use an upgunned variant of the Pershing. As the Allies were advancing to the heartlands of Germany, Americans somehow had to find a way to counter German Panthers and King Tigers. And there were simply no good answers to that riddle at the time, at least in the American roster. As such, it was decided to upgun the M26. It also had additional armor welded to the mantlet and the forward hull of the tank. Due to its impressive capabilities, the tank was affectionately known as Super Pershing. Still, the Tiger II left such an impression that by 1944, the US was working on several heavy tanks of its own. First, American engineers tried to simply give the M6 additional armor and a new 105mm cannon in a new turret. This vehicle, called the M6A2E1, could take on a Tiger, but it was not meant to be. With a weight of around 70 tons, the tank was simply too big and too heavy to make it viable. It was supposed to survive a long campaign in the Ardennes, but it was very limited in what terrain it could operate on, and it couldn't climb a 24-degree slope. On the other hand, the efforts of American engineers were definitely not in vain. The M6A2E1 was not a success, but it helped the US in their work on 3 other heavy tank designs: the T-29, the T-30, and the T-34. The main difference between the 3 was in the armament they had. The T-29 was a kind of a baseline design with a 105mm cannon. The T-30 prototype received the massive 155mm gun, one of the most powerful tank guns available at the time, and the T-34 was given a 120mm cannon. Out of the three, the T-29 was considered to be the most promising design, thanks to its good balance between firepower and fire rate. Its production could start as early as 1945, but then the USSR revealed their IS-3, and the US had to adjust their plans. And also, the war was finally over, obviously. The T-32, which was another notable American heavy tank design, shared a similar fate. Just as the T-29, it was based on the Pershing. But while the T-29 deviated a lot from the original vehicle, and in many ways the T-32 was somewhat less ambitious, broadly speaking, it was the same vehicle, just with a new gun of the same caliber, a new turret, and thicker armor. Just to put it into perspective, it had around 300mm of armor in its mantlet area. At the same time, even the T-32E1 variant, which featured even more armor, had a weight of only 54 tons. Even though it had a few problems with its transmission, it was a pretty impressive vehicle, all things considered. Too bad it arrived way too late. The war was already over. Still, at least one of the American heavies made it to mass production. We're talking about the M103 manufactured by Chrysler. The key part of this design was its powerful 120mm gun, which allowed the tank to engage targets at long range. As the tank was expected to fire its shots from a distance, its armor was not made with close-range combat in mind, meaning that engineers could keep it relatively light, allowing the tank to be pretty mobile. The elliptically shaped hull and turret of the M103 also defined the looks of the American tank designs of the 1950s, with the M48 getting a similar hull later down the line. In the long run, the deliberate emphasis on aircraft and mobile forces paid off in a big way. Allies were able to fight German vehicles without relying on heavy tanks, with only a few of them making it into actual combat. At the same time, all that work provided engineers with lots of valuable insight that later proved to be very useful when designing new medium tanks and MBTs. Are there any American heavies that you are particularly fond of? Feel free to tell us about them in the comments below. We do really want to know.